Thank you very, very much. Ebenezer Scrooge is a name that many of you will know. He was a miserable, miserable old man. If somebody would wish him a Merry Christmas, all he would be able to say is, "Bah, humbug." One Christmas Eve, it was bitterly, bitterly cold. And in the next office was his employee, Bob Cratchit. And Bob Cratchit had only one coal in his fireplace. And Mr. Scrooge kept the coal box in his office. And Bob Cratchit knew that if he were to go and ask for a second piece of coal for his fire, he would be terminated. And so he worked instead wrapped in a big white comforter. On his way out the door that Christmas Eve at 5 o'clock, Scrooge called out from his office to Bob Cratchit, "I suppose you'll want the whole day off tomorrow." That same Christmas Eve, two men came to Ebenezer Scrooge canvassing for the poor. And he said, "Are there no more prisons or workhouses? It seems I already give enough to support those institutions. And if the poor have nowhere to go, then maybe they should go there." Ebenezer Scrooge was a miserable old man. He had no hope, no grace, and therefore no joy in his life. His misery was, in fact, a spiritual problem. What Scrooge needed was a new message, a new hope, and a new way forward to live his life. And so there were sent to him that night, in the wee hours of Christmas morning, 3 ghosts: the ghost of Christmas past, the ghost of Christmas present, and the ghost of Christmas yet to come. And in the wee hours of Christmas morning, he was indeed awakened in the night by the first ghost, the ghost of Christmas past. And that ghost transported him to scenes of earlier years, in times when he had been happy, times when he had not been the miserable old man that he'd become. He was transported to happier days, to happier Christmases. For example, when he was just a young boy away at boarding school, getting ready for the Christmas holiday, when his little sister burst into his room and ran over to him and gave him a great big hug and kissed him and said, "My dear, dear brother, we've come to take you home." He was transported to another Christmas, where on Christmas Eve, as a young man, his boss threw a great big party for all of his employees and their families. Then he saw another Christmas when he had not been alone. In fact, he had a girlfriend with whom he was in love. In the time of the prophet Isaiah, Israel too was in misery. They were economically impoverished, militarily devastated, and politically orphaned. Their national life was misery. And their national misery, too, was a spiritual problem. You see, their misery was the result of their unfaithfulness to God, of their subconscious decisions over the decades and the centuries to stop living in relationship with God. What they needed was a new message, a message of hope, a message about how they could live a new and a different kind of life going forward. And so to the people of Israel were sent the prophets such as Isaiah. In chapter 4, from which we heard a short reading just a few minutes ago, Isaiah showed the people of Israel some happier times in the past, years when they had been happy. For example, they had once been slaves in the land of Egypt, but God led them out of their slavery. God led them beyond the grasp of the Egyptian army. God led them through the waters of the sea, all the while guiding them with a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. Where once they had been oppressed and isolated as slaves, God had made them into a people. God had guided and protected them. Ebenezer Scrooge was later awakened a second time that night, this time by the ghost of Christmas Present. And the ghost of Christmas Present revealed to Scrooge some contemporary scenes of Christmas joy that would reveal his own misery. The ghost showed him, for example, the Christmas Day celebration at the house of his nephew, who had invited all of their family together, and where the whole family was having a wonderful, joyous time. Scrooge, too, had been invited, but he had said, "Bah humbug," and decided not to go. And the ghost showed him the house of Bob Cratchit on Christmas Day, where Mr. and Mrs. Cratchit and their many children were very, very poor, and yet they were happy. They had laid before them a very modest Christmas dinner of a goose and some mashed potatoes and a little bit of applesauce. And they were overjoyed to have it. And Scrooge saw in that house how one of the many children, the youngest in fact, named Tiny Tim, was a cripple. He had iron braces on his legs and even then needed to walk with a crutch. And yet he was maybe the happiest of them all. He said, "On Christmas Day, I get to remind people of the one who was born and who healed the lame." The ghost of Christmas Present held up a mirror for Scrooge to help him decide if he liked what he saw. The prophet Isaiah as well held up a mirror for the people of Israel. And when they looked into that mirror, they saw how awful things had become for them. You see, in the time of the prophet, they had been absolutely crushed by the Assyrian Empire. Their villages and towns had been laid to waste, even their great capital, Jerusalem, which is set on a really high hill and was fortified and one would have thought safe from attack. And yet it had been devastated, and the people were living in extreme poverty, and they had no way forward. Imagine the scenes that we see on the news today of people who are living in war-torn countries. And maybe the plight of those who feel the need to flee from areas of war and become refugees, living in overcrowding and in appalling conditions, in an absolute desperate poverty, misery by the very definition of the word. And that was the people of Israel. In the first 3 chapters of Isaiah's book, which preceded the reading we heard today, we learn in great detail how sorrowful they had become and how it had been a consequence of their unfaithfulness to God. And not as if they were basically good people who just didn't get to the temple quite often enough. They were people among whom lying and cheating and stealing and corruption and murder and adultery had become commonplace. When Isaiah held up the mirror for the people of Israel, they realized that their misery was not really an economic problem or a military problem or a political problem. It was a spiritual one. For the third and final time, Scrooge was awakened in the night by the ghost of Christmas yet to come. And Scrooge was able to foresee a time in the not too distant future when he had died. And when the news of his passing had reached some of his former business associates, they were sitting around talking about him, and they decided that in fact they would only attend his funeral if lunch was to be provided. He saw in this same time his housekeeper looting his personal possessions, including his bed sheets. He saw at this time that the Cratchit household was in mourning because Tiny Tim had died. And he had died because the family was not able to pay for his medical care. The prophet Isaiah didn't have to work too hard to tell the people of Israel what their future would be like if they continued on the same path they were already on. They knew all too well that on that same path they had no future unless it would be a very dim one indeed. Well, perhaps I don't need to tell you what happened next to Ebenezer Scrooge. He awoke from his long, dream-filled, sleepless night to find that it was Christmas morning. And he was a changed man. From then on, he resolved to live his life with grace and hope and joy. He got up and he went to church. And then he went on to the house of his nephew, where he celebrated the holiday with what extended family he had. And even before that, he decided that he would send a prize-winning turkey to the Cratchit household. The next day at work, when Bob Cratchit came in, he found out that he was getting a raise and that his boss had promised to meet his needs and that he would even be able to keep a decent fire in the hearth. And it was said from then on, Scrooge even became like a second father to Tiny Tim. Perhaps I don't need to tell you as well what happened in the story of God's salvation. God fulfilled the promises that had been made to God's people. Now, in the real world of human history, things take a longer time. But in due time, in the fullness of time, as the Apostle Paul said, God returned in power and in grace to the midst of humankind. God came in the person of Jesus, who is called Emmanuel, God with us. Christmas is a very intense time of year, isn't it? Sometimes we have an intensity of happiness and joy, and sometimes we may have an intensity of loneliness or of sorrow. But there is a message of good news and hope for us. And that is that God is with us. We know that God has been with us in the past in the form of our ancestors, both biological and spiritual. We know that God led the people out of slavery in Egypt and formed them into a people. God provided guidance and protection and eventually led them to a land of their own. We know that God came into our midst as humankind in the person of Jesus. And we also know that God's character is unfailing, that God is perfectly faithful, that if God has made promises, God will keep them. That if God has laid before us a path and invited us to walk along it, that God will be there to guide us. And since we know that God has been at work in the past and that God is always faithful, we can also be sure that God will be with us in the future. That is a hope on which we can rely no matter what. No matter what our feelings are in a given moment, no matter what our present experience. We have a message of good news directly from the mouth of God on which we can rely. And it is a message made never more clear to us than at the time of Christmas, when we remember the birth of our Messiah, Jesus, in Bethlehem of Judea. From now on, might each of us as individuals and all of us as a congregation resolve to live in light of this good news, and where necessary to be transformed by it. Might we resolve as individuals and a community to live faithfully toward God, to live justly toward others, to live joyfully with ourselves. And may we do this so that people will say of us from this day forward, as it was once said of Ebenezer Scrooge, they knew how to keep Christmas well. Amen. Our next song together is in the hymn book number 651.